Bon, eh bien, écoutez, merci à tous d'être là pour la dernière session de notre journée d'études, qui est une session qui va porter sur la question qui a été à l'horizon de nos questionnements aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire la présidentielle actuelle, les élections et les surprises d'octobre qui ont été nombreuses pour ce cycle. Donc nous avons pour en parler deux invités américains et nous sommes particulièrement contents qu'ils aient accepté de rester, de participer à distance pour cet événement. Je me tournais vers eux et donc je vais passer à l'anglais si ça ne vous dérange pas. Ray, Eric, can you hear us?
Yes.
So I guess the best thing to do is for us to introduce ourselves. So my name is François de Chantal, and I am a professor of American civilization for the Université de Paris. And I will be moderating along with Lorik.
I'm Lorik Kenneton. I'm associate professor at Université de Versailles-Saint-Quentin.
Eric, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Hi. First off, my apologies for not being able to speak French. It's always a little awkward to have these events, but I appreciate your indulgence. And I'm Eric Oliver, professor of political science at the University of Chicago.
Hello, everyone. And I'm Ray LaRaja, professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
Hey, thank you. So we've had a long and productive day here, and we've been discussing the Trump presidency and the last 4 years. And one of the topics that we briefly touched on is the issue of norms, the issue of democratic norms, and the way those democratic norms were impacted by Trump and his administration. So maybe that's a topic that you would like to elaborate on, Eric. I think you are interested in that topic, so the floor is yours.
Sure, I can start with that. And I think when we think about norms, we can think about norms in several ways. We can think about norms from an institutional perspective, which is that norms are these, basically extra institutional mechanisms that fill in the gaps in democracy, where we don't specify formal codes of democratic behavior, and then these norms flourish as mechanisms to fill in those gaps. And then you have a president, and Trump is not the first president to push against norms. A lot of other presidents in our history have pushed back against norms. Probably surprisingly, like for example, Jimmy Carter in the 1970s pushed back against a lot of formalism in the institution. Richard Nixon pushed back against a lot of norms concerning corruption. But obviously, Trump has been a norm shatterer and has not only violated norms, but violated norms in a particularly conspicuous way. And one of the questions that arises is why? Why does he do this? And we typically think about when presidents violate norms, they're doing it and they're running some sort of risk of cost, that they're forced to violate a norms because it's the only way that they can get what they want, and they're willing to pay the cost of the norm violation. And I think with Trump, it's perhaps something of there's a different scenario, which is his conspicuous norm violation is part and parcel of his populist ethos. It's a way of trying to signal his, even though he is president, that he remains somehow or another an outsider to the process. I mean, one of the most curious, and I think in his campaign, they haven't really been able to pull this off successfully, is this idea of he both wrapping himself in the institution of the presidency and all the trappings of this institution and trying to seem very presidential. And so they do all of these staged events where he's like in front of Air Force One, the big presidential jet, or he's walking up the steps of the White House, and they have these events in front of the White House. Yet his rhetoric, he still acts as if he's an outsider to the whole political process. And I think one way of continuing to violate norms is allows him to reaffirm that outsider status, and say that he is still not part of the political establishment. And for his supporters, this is very typical with a populist political rhetoric. It's one about sort of shattering. Populists around the world typically are rude, or they shatter social conventions, and they do that as a way of signaling to ordinary people that they're not part of an elite. That in fact that it is typically elites, but the political, economic, social elites that are enforcing norms of all kinds, and a populist certifies his outsider status typically by violating those norms. So I think we see that with Trump trying to weave in between these various symbolic and institutional trappings. And I think that's a big part of what he says. Now, there's a lot of speculation of, is Trump this authoritarian? I don't think he has really the wherewithal to sustain kind of a real anti-democratic, a systematic anti-democratic kind of push. Most of his anti-democratic efforts are pretty gestural. They're not very well thought out. Many of them are getting overturned in courts. As an autocrat, he's been pretty remarkably unsuccessful of building an autocratic system in the United States. Yet I think because he's so conspicuous in his willingness to push back against norms, that it generates a lot of attention and a lot of concern. I'll leave that there. I'll let Ray come in, and perhaps he has more to say on that.
Okay, I will pick up a little bit where I'll talk a little bit about norms, mostly about the Republican Party. First, thanks to Laurique and Francois for inviting me to the University of Chicago Center in Paris and other sponsors. So I'll discuss 3 points very briefly to highlight a theme that I wanted to bring up about the US political system. I think is going to remain in a relatively unstable period and polarized period for at least another decade or more. And I know there's great hope now, but why? Why is this? So let me start with the underlying social dimension. I'll not say much here, but the US is, as you've talked about today, is undergoing profound demographic changes that's going to translate into unstable politics for a while. Right now, we have an aging baby boomer cohort, overwhelmingly white, that dominates the political agenda on the right and the left, overlaying an influx of immigrants over many decades. And we're seeing rural and urban divides with economic opportunity growing in metropolitan areas while the rural areas in decline. So Europe is experiencing this as well, but it's a different flavor in the US. The second element of instability, and this is more of where I wanted to go today, is the party system. And the road ahead will be more or less bumpy, depending on the degree to which the party system absorbs these social changes and how it does so. And with these social changes I mentioned, the anxieties, the racial resentments, the nostalgia for the past have found their home in the Republican Party. Eric has written about this. It's become a white-based coalition of populists, mostly rural and non-professional class, social traditionalists, the evangelical and fundamentalists, and what I would call the old industry economic elites who make their money from these extractive industries, commodities, real estate, Wall Street. The coalition is built around fear, and understandably so, because they're facing a democratic cliff on all fronts. There's going to be fewer of them in the coming decades. And I say this as an analyst, not as a partisan. We have one very unhealthy party in the US, the Republican Party. It's been worsening for several decades. Une décomposition, une pourriture, something that you might call that in French. And the violation of norms for the GOP, even for those who are not populist, is this disdain for actual policy. They never really offer, for instance, an alternative to Obama's healthcare policy. They hated it, repeal and replace, but they had nothing to replace it with. That's not a healthy party. And then a norm developing that Trump increased of not seeing the opposition as legitimate. Donald Trump's nomination and his victory was a consequence of this highly reactionary party coalition, combined with a weak party structure where establishment Republicans can no longer manage its affairs of the party. It's a party that's become untethered to the realities of governing, even before the Tea Party movement, going back to Newt Gingrich. And its structural weaknesses reflect this weakening, in my view, of the party organizations in the US and the rise of issue activists who have technology, money, media to dominate the party. I could say more about this in the discussion. So what happens if the party gets defeated in this election badly? It'll be an opportunity for traditional elites to frame the loss as a repudiation of Trumpism. But I don't think you're going to see the kind of structural changes that are necessary to improve the health of the Republican Party. I'm not optimistic because the infrastructure of the extreme elements, some of the elements that Eric has been talking about, but other elements as well, it remains and includes the money of the crazy billionaires who put up money in elections and recruit people, the partisan media like Fox, the uncompromising interest groups run by activists, and of course the social media dominated by conspiracy theories. And a bold Democratic Party, should they take back, that's just going to threaten these groups even more. So the Republican Party, it has a leadership that still believes in America first. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Cotton, the Senator, and a younger generation that you haven't even seen yet at the state level. They are really extreme. The party will remain fully aligned with racially resentful white voters, so long as it can manage to get victories in this fragmented political system of separation of powers and federalism. And like other parties on the wane in democracies everywhere, they're going to use any voter dilution methods to keep its advantages. And so again, this is the ongoing breaking of democratic norms. We see it in other countries. We're seeing it in the United States. And I see at least 10 years of resentment and turmoil until the baby boomer generation starts to die out. So let me say, lastly, in terms of governing and policy, I want to say a few words. There's going to be instability because the parties remain so competitive for control of government. Each are going to play to their base and overreach in looking for policies that the activists want. So rather than put together a bipartisan coalition, it's going to increase the likelihood that a majority party will lose the subsequent election. So, okay, so the Democrats, maybe they take back. So you'll see some return to normalcy in international affairs in terms of treaties and alliances, and a continued pivot towards China's rise. Domestically, you'll see room for bolder policies in the Democratic Party, given the exigencies of the economy and the pandemic. But since passing laws is less a bipartisan practice in the United States, there's practically no moderate Republicans to make any deals with, and they have little incentives. The Democrats are going to win with the left side of their party and push for policies that might scare the middle of the road voters. And that will create another backlash push, I think, that might jeopardize their hold in coming congressional elections. So it's going to be a balancing act for the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi. And they're going to need some big legislative wins, but to avoid looking like they are overreaching, because Americans don't like that. They don't want single payer health care. That's probably not going to happen. They don't want radical reforms of the police at the state level. So that's the future I see. It's not a very hopeful summary. Despite a probable big Democratic win and some return to normalcy, the next decades are going to be unstable politically in the US. I mean, unstable relative to how we've been in the rest, earlier in the 20th century. Because in a party that's losing its hold on social and political power, they're unlikely to go gently into the night. So let me stop there.
So what you're describing, Ray, is indeed not very optimistic. What you're telling us is that the Republican Party is somehow an irrational party. And my question would be then, how can Democrats face an irrational party like the Republican Party you're describing? And where does that irrational status come from? I mean, this is most unusual. So that would be my next questions. Eric or Ray?
I think Eric actually has written about this exactly, the irrationality of the Republican Party. So he should talk.
All right, sure. Thanks, Ray. A book I co-authored with Tom Wood that came out 2 years ago is called Enchanted America. And the idea of the book was first inspired by research we were doing into conspiracy theories. And the question we had was, why were people so enamored with conspiracy theories? We were doing surveys and finding half of Americans were embracing at least one conspiracy theory. And what we found was that the biggest predictor of whether or not one believed in conspiracy theories was having a lot of supernatural or paranormal beliefs. And so that got us thinking, well, what is the commonality between conspiracy theories and supernatural beliefs and paranormal beliefs? And we would also see other beliefs like other anti-science beliefs, fears of genetically modified foods, fears of gluten, this kind of constellation of attitudes that seem to be out there. And we ended up coming to an analysis that American politics were not simply divided by ideology or by race, or by partisanship, but what we might call worldview. And on one end of the spectrum are people we call rationalists. They have kind of a Enlightenment style worldview. They believe in science, reason, logical deduction, and facts. And on the other end of the spectrum are people we label as intuitionists. And they tend to rely heavily on symbols, metaphors, their own intuitions, their feelings from their guts, their emotions drive a lot of their decisions. Now, obviously, most people use a combination of both rational and intuitionist proclivities, but how far we created a scale which we think captures this pretty well, and how far one is on a scale predicts a lot about one's politics and particularly one's susceptibility to certain kind of rhetorical gestures. Donald Trump really articulated this intuitionist type of politics. Now, one of the things that we've seen is that we would expect this kind of intuition politics to be relatively consistent across the political spectrum. And we argue that, 30 or 40 years ago, it probably was. And you can still see a lot of intuitionism on the political left in the United States. There's still a lot of conspiracy theories on the left. There's a lot of magical thinking on the left. But what we've seen in the past 30 years is a greater alignment of this with conservatism, that conservatism has become an intuitionist movement. And I think a big part of that has to do with the rise of evangelical Christianity and evangelical Christians as kind of the anchor group within the Republican Party, and as probably the central organizing principle now, and it's become the central organizing principle in modern conservatism. So if you go in the United States, for example, if you go into a liberal neighborhood, it's very common to see a sign that liberals put in front of their houses, and that the sign reads as kind of a statement of liberal beliefs. And it's, we believe that Black Lives Matter, that all love is equal, and that's a signal to marriage equality and gay rights, that science is real. And liberalism has begun to identify itself very conspicuously now as a rationalist type of enterprise. Conservatism increasingly has become animated by conspiracy theories, really outlandish metaphors and rhetoric. And I think a lot of that is because it speaks to this evangelical base, which tends to see and interpret political events in these mythic terms. For one of the things that we've discovered in our surveys is that a lot of Americans, for example, believe not only that the Bible is the literal word of God, but that we are living in end times as foretold by biblical prophecy. It's about 25% of Americans hold that belief. And I always think that, if you're a person who thinks that the rapture is imminent and that, the second coming is about to occur, then everything is symbolically potent. Every particular event gets understood through that prism. And what that's also meant, I think, for republicanism and conservatives is that, and Ray mentioned this earlier, rational conservatives have been now really relegated to the wilderness. They don't have much of an audience. The typical publications and journals by which rational conservatives would articulate, and I think in some ways control the conservative movement for a long time, have really been diminished. And partly this is the rise of social media, partly it's the fracturization of traditional media as well. It's created a much less coherent state of public opinion in the United States. And it's allowed this much more transgressive or non-rational movement to arise within conservatism. And, to echo Ray's point, for me, in the United States, democracy has always been a very rationalist enterprise. If you look at the writers of the Constitution and sort of the initial voices about the Republic, it was very much thinking of this as a rationalist term, and there was a lot of apprehension in institutional design with passions and intuitions and emotions in politics, and it was an attempt to push back about that. And when an intuitionist type of politics enters into our discourse, and particularly when it comes to dominate both a party and an ideological movement, I think we're going to see that itself probably lends it more towards anti-democratic tendencies. Intuitionism is not very amenable to democratic process. It's really not amenable to discussion, consensus, debate. There's no even clear discussion about facts. In the book I mentioned, in an interview I had with this one woman, and she had a lot of very contradictory policy beliefs. Like, she hated Obamacare and public health care, but on the one hand, but she liked her old age, medical care that she got. She didn't see those two things as actually connected with one another. And after this long discussion back and forth, and I was trying to help her reconcile these competing opinions, she turned and looked at me and she said, well, the difference between you and me is that you believe in reason and I believe in the Bible. And I think that was a very prescient comment on her part. It really sums up this division of worldview that's occurring. And I think this is probably the thing that gives me most concern, is the sort of absence of a shared meaning framework by which public discourse can take place. And what we're seeing now in the United States increasingly is the inability to have even a common frame of reference. So you have media echo chambers which reiterate their own worldviews and see any other worldview that's not part of that as heretical. And completely without any kind of merit. And the ability to have venues by which compromise or consensus is built is becoming really under strain in our public discourse.
I'll just say a few things to compliment. Eric has written the book on this. It's interesting, the United States, religious revivalism in American history has been a source for many progressive movements, abolitionism especially. But in this century, there's been a kind of rigidification, and it's become aligned with these white fundamentalists. And so you don't combine what Eric's talking about, the intuition, with a kind of rational basis of discourse. So it's very it's very different from what's been going on historically, at least in the Republican Party. Let me just say one thing about, you asked also about, I want to talk to the governing aspect. What do the Democrats do? I think this is going to be a tough balancing act for the Democrats should they take over complete control of government, because they have a restive left flank of young people and progressives, and yet the vast majority of Americans are interested more in what we call bread and butter issues. The reason the Democrats are doing so well in so many places is because of their talk about things like healthcare, education, material interests. And so it's going to be, to the degree that the Democrats try to address all the concerns of the left flank, it's going to put in jeopardy senators from more rural states. It's going to put in jeopardy some of these people who won Congress who happen to take more moderate positions. So of course, the times might demand some more bold action, but it's going to be dangerous for the Democratic Party to go too far, because the Republican Party, for all its problems and its narrow coalition, structurally is still capable of winning in the United States, given the advantages of rural areas.
I had a question about overreach, but
Go ahead, Lloyd.
Ray anticipated my question about
he did.
overreach already.
Okay. Well, so I have another question on the the consequences of what Eric described, the electoral consequences of what you described, Eric. It seems to me that the Republican Party you've described is a party that would have a hard time convincing a majority of the American people. But at the same time, what you're describing may be also regarded as a way to energize voters, energize Republican voters. So what would be your assessment on the electoral consequences of this ideological / irrational shift that you've outlined?
Yes, Ray mentioned this earlier, and I think there's a lot to say to this, that the rhetoric of intuitionism, the political rhetoric of intuitionism is typically based in anxiety and apprehension. And that is the mobilizing strategy, which is if we terrify people, they'll come to us and we will offer them some short-term emotional palliative to say, okay, we can make you feel better in the short run. But I mean, there's an interesting irony there. If you think about, like, for example, conspiracy theory, because I think people adopt or embrace conspiracy theories because they feel uncertain in the world. They don't know what's happening, and they're trying to give some kind of coherence, and they're trying to make sense of inexplicable events. And then a conspiracy theory is attractive because it typically speaks to kind of innate ways of processing things. The idea that we anthropomorphize certain institutions with a single intentionality, or that the idea that there are invisible forces that make things happen. And the irony is that if you say, okay, yes, there is a small secret cabal that's controlling everything in the world and making bad things happen and has nefarious institutions. And you think, on the one hand, wow, I really know that. That's great. So in the short run, I feel a little bit better. But in the long run, what are you thinking? Oh my God, there's actually this small group that's really controlling things, and they're really evil and they're bad. And what do I do with that? And I think this is the dilemma of participatory politics in this era, which is you can say, yes, there are these evil forces, or invoke this kind of these institutional and intuitionist processes. But at some point, how does that get sustained? How do you sustain that over a period of time? And I think that has maybe perhaps short-term benefits, but I don't really know about what its long-term consequences are. My suspicion is that when it comes to electoral politics, it's more materialist types of issues that win out over the long haul. I think the Democrats have correctly identified that their strategy is not to sort of engage in debunking conspiracy theories, but just to shift the conversation back to questions of kind of systematic challenges that people are facing in terms of employment and healthcare and their own economic security. And eventually that will win itself out. And so I don't know how this works out on the long haul. You know, we can see an increasing number of Republican down ballot candidates who are embracing this kind of intuitionist politics. And I think they're trying to emulate Trump's success. If Trump does not win a re-election, and in fact, if he loses the election badly, what remains unclear is to what extent that sustains itself in the party, or does that kind of approach become discredited and the party move back to its kind of more traditional kind of pro-business type of orientation? I don't think anybody has a really clear sense of that right now. My sense of that is that when political leaders lose badly, the parties tend to sort of run away from them. But this type of Trumpist rhetoric and Trumpist style seems to have really taken hold in a big part of the Republican Party. And also, given the nature of polarization and the way congressional districts are drawn, it really increasingly that the extremists within the party are driving the party's agendas. And so incumbents are terrified of getting primary challengers, particularly from the right. And so if this is what's become animating the conservative base, is this kind of intuitionist rhetoric, this conspiratorial rhetoric, this xenophobic, this whole, like I said before, this kind of constellation of attitudes that accompanies this, it might not be as easy for traditionalist party leaders to kind of pull the Republican Party back to where it was. But I don't think anybody really knows at this point. It's very, very speculative. in my lifetime, this is pretty unprecedented. I mean, it was always, the Republican Party was always the staid party of business and the Chamber of Commerce and these kind of button-down type figures who, you know, would always manage to kind of keep the party in line. And I don't know what kind of grip they have anymore over the party, but perhaps Ray has more to suggest on this.
Actually, I agree with what you say, and they are losing grip. And part of it, as I alluded to in the beginning, has to do with changes in technology. One phenomenon that people heralded as a good thing is small donors. Okay, people said, well, that'll democratize and play down the role of money in politics. Well, it turns out that small donors are incredibly extreme. Just even more so in some ways than the people who give big money. And politicians use these intuitionist rhetoric to attract that money. And it makes them automatic candidates that can compete for the nomination in the primaries. I know that, you know, France now uses some primaries. I wish you well. Primaries really are a source of tremendous power for some of the more extreme elements, the most passionate people, often with very good intentions, but disproportionate power, not concerned about, less concerned about actual governing and the need for compromise. I did a survey, a core group in the Republican Party, these populists, are the most uncompromising. They think politicians, somewhat 75% said politicians should not compromise their principles at all. Whereas in the Democratic Party, the same group of populists who supported people like Sanders were much more willing to compromise than on the Republican side.
I had a follow-up on end times and anxiety, and I think in 2016, I think it was the PRRI, and there was another a survey about that, showed that a large majority of Trump voters thought that 2016 was last exit before the end. It was last chance election, and so the question is, along the way, how many times can this be reproduced? And if we think back about the late 19th century, early 20th century, even in the 19th century, there was a number of moments when this was on the agenda. This last chance to save the soul of America, not the soul of the nation. That's the other side. But you see that there's this last chance rhetoric that's getting increasingly present, especially on the right. So that was one thing. There was a second thing, and I forgot. I think you answered it. And the third thing was about the primaries, especially in France. And the question is, one question I had, but we're past that point, is how do you reconstruct norms that have been shattered? And another thought is, how do you deconstruct primaries when they have been heralded as a form of improving democracy? How do you walk back for a party like a major government party? How do you walk back, realizing that it's actually not so good? Walking back is, at least on the face of it, undemocratic. You walk back to the smoke-filled rooms.
Good questions. I could start with that one. I could start with the primaries one, and maybe Eric wants to talk more about the high stakes aspects. In terms of walking back the primaries, the Republican Party, and to some extent the Democratic Party, have lost control. There used to be a kind of what we call a pre-primary phase where party elites instructed the major donors, we like this person. And as I alluded to, the small donor situation has changed that. And also campaign finance rules allow, as big billionaires to weigh in on their favored crazy candidates. So how do you walk this back to give the party establishment, you're not going to go back to having them the smoke-filled rooms of the past. So one suggestion is to allow some pre-vetting of candidates by a broad committee of party representatives that include elected officials from the parties. And they would say, well, and they would ask them a series of questions, and before they could run on the nomination, I mean, one very basic question is, which party do you belong to? And if you're not in the Republican Party, like Donald Trump wasn't, or even Bernie Sanders wasn't a Democrat. Well, I'm sorry, you can't run in our primary. That'll create some tensions, but there needs to be some professional vetting before voters have a say. And this is not just the United States, but elsewhere as well. So that's one way to start thinking about putting a little more structure to this. It's going to be a tough battle for the elites to do that. Eric, I'll pass to you.
I would just, to echo that, I think what we're going to see is as norms fail, and we think of norms as being informal mechanisms, and if they fail to be perpetuated, then they get replaced with formalized mechanisms. And so one thing that I would anticipate that if Biden comes to power and Trump loses, you might see this actually on both parties in terms of their own party structure, implementing some reforms that Ray has suggested. And I'm also anticipating that we're going to see this much more so. One of the legislative agendas of the Democratic Party, assuming that they come to power, will be trying to formalize some democratic processes and protect, against a future demagogue. I think what Trump did reveal in his actions is the vulnerability of American democratic institutions to bad actors. And in some sense, democracy in the United States has been shielded by Trump's own incompetence. But a more wily and ambitious type of demagogue could have done a lot more damage to American democratic processes than he was able to do. So I would imagine that we're going to see a more formalization of certain kinds of electoral processes. What that's going to be, I'm not exactly sure, but that would be my prediction on that. On the idea of, yes, is this the end times election? Is this the end times election? There's a great book that I don't know if it's still people are familiar with, that was written in the 1950s by a sociologist named Leon Festinger, and it was called When Prophecy Fails. And he did this ethnographic study of a doomsday cult and kind of went in with them and was watching them. And then they said the end of the world was happening on this date. And then when it didn't, the world didn't end, what did the cult members do? And what he famously noted was that they said, oh my God, it was our prayers that actually forestalled that from happening. And they rather than sort of accept and update their beliefs, they kind of rationalize what they already experienced in terms of their priors. And so the motivating rhetoric of end times gets perpetuated again and again and again. And rather than people actually rejecting their beliefs, that's pretty rare that people will give up their belief system. And part of the reason why is that it's part of their emotional edifice. It's a tool for them to manage their own emotional states. And what you'll see, I think, amongst evangelical Christians in the United States is this cycle of religious leaders, stimulating anxiety, sort of saying God is watching you, bad things are about to happen. But if you come and get prayer and you can find solace through our rituals, then we will temporarily mollify you. And it's almost like a drug dependence, and it's like a stoking an addiction to a certain kind of emotional state, and then offering a certain kind of solace. And that definitely happens, I think, in kind of more charismatic religious traditions in the United States. And it's increasingly spilling over into this kind of political rhetoric too. We are subject to all of Donald Trump's tweets and his gestures, and they're increasingly becoming like it's back to this. California is going to hell. New York is in ruins. He's basically decrying the destruction of the nation. And that's what he goes back to. And I think his base still really feels that's still potent for them. I think the difficulty for him, it's kind of worn thin with the portion of the American population who does not buy into this type of worldview.
So maybe we will, time is running short, so maybe we will take a few questions from the audience. Anything you would like to comment on? Olivier, Jean-Baptiste, you may want to get closer to the mic. Maybe.
And from the camera too. Hi, Ray. Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Hey. It's in front of the camera. All right. I have two questions. If I follow you carefully,
I believe the Koch brothers are very irrational. Are we seeing a fight for the soul of the GOP between Koch brothers type of conservatives and Trump type conservatives? And we're going to witness for the long term what happens. And on the short term, let's say the Democrats win a short majority in the Senate and the House and the presidency. How do you govern with a minority party that is unwilling to govern, uninterested? On the other, actually, they have an interest in not governing. You get rid of the filibuster, and how far do you go knowing you have a new majority on the Supreme Court?
Ray, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, those are really tough questions. Yeah, there is a battle within the Republican Party between the kind of the business billionaires like the Koch brothers and the rest. And it was a marriage of convenience. If you want a book that makes this argument more broadly, Hacker and Pearson have a book called "Let Them Eat Tweets" about the combination of the kind of economic elites and the more populist elements of the party. I do think that the business elites are going to, and we've already seen this, for instance, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for the first time is now endorsing many Democrats in elections because they realize that the Republican Party has gone off the rails, and it's actually hurting their business interests because nothing's getting done. So there's apparently some adjustments. We'll see how long that lasts. But the Republican Party has to expand its coalition. And Eric has made this argument before. I want to see two healthy parties, and that means being more open to Latinos, being more open to Southeast Asians, Indian Americans. And the Democratic Party is the secular party. It used to have evangelicals in the party, but its rhetoric is perhaps too forceful on some of the secular stuff that puts fear into the other party. So there needs to be more cross-cutting coalitions. The parties align too much on white identity, non-white, religion, non-religion. It's a catastrophe to have such polarizing underlying factors like that. In terms of governing, this is going to be, the Democrats are just going to try to push things through. I can't imagine, Eric might think differently, but I can't imagine them getting any Republican votes. I'm guessing they probably will take the Senate, but I can't imagine them getting votes, and there'd be very strong incentives to get rid of that supermajority filibuster. I don't know if they'll go so far as to pack the Supreme Court, putting more Supreme Court justices on, but they will be ruling as a kind of, they're not going to make the same mistakes as Obama. I don't know if I call them mistakes. He tried to do it bipartisan. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that. I think the Democrats learned a lesson, particularly in the Obama's second term, and where there were, Mitch McConnell's governing strategy for the Republicans in the Senate was just obstruct everything. And we're already beginning to see gestures towards that. So for example, the newest relief bill that is stalled in Congress right now to address the economic consequences of COVID in the United States. It's, arguably the Senate Republicans are seeing the fact that they're going to be out of power in the next 2 years. And they're not very enthusiastic about trying to solve any problems right now because that's a way for them to return back to power. The U.S. economy is in a major recession in 18 months. They're hoping to repeat what they found in 2010, which was that would be their vehicle and their way back in. And so, that may sound cynical, but there's nothing that Mitch McConnell can do that would surprise me as far as his cynicism goes. And so I think that the Democrats are aware of this now. And going back to what Ray was saying earlier, there is a young, very restive element that's far to the left in the party that I feel like their idea was, well, we went along with Biden on this, and so we want our due, and we're not as interested in this notion of consensus building politics that typically characterized American congressional behavior for much of the past 80 years. And so I think we're going to be moving back to that kind of situation. And I don't know what that means for court packing. To me, it's very telling that Biden has not come out and said that he won't pack the courts. That seems like a pretty big gesture, and that might be a little too much for the coalition as a whole. On the other hand, the way that the Republicans have just once again the Supreme Court historically there was an idea of trying to attract as many senators to your candidate as possible, and that norm of trying to build the most to legitimize the court by having as much bipartisan support for a candidate, once that was abandoned, and arguably that was eroding over time, but with the refusal to even hear Merrick Garland and appointment to the Supreme Court 4 years ago, I think that norm was completely shattered. And so I hear a lot of Democratic activists that are like, yes, let's pack the court, bring it to 15 justices, and appoint 6 30-something very liberal justices to the Supreme Court, and just play a kind of power politics. I don't know if that's going to hold or not, but the fact that the previous norms, I think, have really been shattered when it comes to these types of issues.
Thanks, Olivier.
Thanks, Ray.
Anyone else? Any other questions in the room? Oh. Okay. One question coming up.
Hi. One quick question. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering what credibility you give to the one scenario that's been raised in the press about a potential loss of Donald Trump, but him really using his new voice as a sort of counter-establishment, like either a news network or something like that. I've read things on that in the U.S. press, and I was wondering if, what credibility you give to that argument, and how does that tie with your discussion about a persistent form of intuitionist, radicality?
Sure. I mean, we're already seeing this in the United States. For a long time, Fox was the sole, at least, broadcast or television network that was able to locate on the political conservatism. But we're now seeing alternative networks that are even more extreme than Fox that are beginning to arise. And it wouldn't surprise me if a Trump or a Trump-like figure gets involved with that, and then we'll see an increasing fractionalization of the right between, I think Fox, which has traditionally been a more establishment conservative type institution, and one of these new networks that are sprouting up, which are unabashed in their promotion of conspiracy theories and this type of intuitionist politics. And presumably, either Trump would have a vested interest or his children might have a vested interest. There's a lot of enthusiasm among certain quarters for Don Trump Jr. as a voice of this. And there are no shortage of other types of people. The person that I would actually watch on this would be Newt Gingrich. He's the one who's probably, most attuned to where the atmosphere of the right is. And if you look at his rhetoric, he's typically following within all of that. And if he, for example, jumped away from Fox and located himself, even more than Trump in some ways, that would be indicative of, I think, a big sea change in the political environment. But Ray, you might have some thoughts on that.
Well, one thing is about Trump, il a besoin de l'argent. He's going to make sure that he needs to make money. He's in debt, and he's going to want to. He made money off The Apprentice. That's how he only made money. His previous reality TV show, maybe there'll be a show called Presidential Apprentice. But I agree with Eric that he is going to try to parlay this, or somebody in the Republican Party, and it's going to fragment the party because it's going to be part of this unending stream of voices, grievance voices. That's going to make it very difficult for the Republican Party to be a governing party at any stage. I didn't even think of this. I haven't been reading these articles, but for so many reasons, I could see Trump trying to do this. He has to pay his legal bills.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all. I think
There was a question on the chat.
there was a question on the chat. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I have access to it. I think it was something about do the Catholics are on the side of magic or on the side of reason?
Did you get that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so we found this out in our surveys, and I asked this in two ways. And I asked people to identify what denomination they're in. And then I asked them to identify themselves. Do you consider yourself conservative, orthodox, or fundamentalist in your beliefs? And there's a big difference between Catholics who would say yes to the second question, who identify themselves as conservative Catholics versus Catholics who don't. And the Catholics who identify themselves as conservative tend to have a much more magical type of belief system. And they tend to be a lot more mystical, and their beliefs tend to align much more with evangelicals. And well, as what we see with other religions, tendencies in the United States, the Catholicism in the United States is being increasingly bifurcated between these two branches. And then a lot of it has to do with a lot of Catholics in the United States, sort of old Catholic population, Polish, Irish, Italians, are moving away from the church in larger and larger numbers. They're tending to secularize. And a lot of Latinos who are coming in, who are increasingly becoming a larger proportion of the Catholic Church, many of them have these more kinds of magical beliefs. And this is, Ray mentioned this earlier, when I would see the Republican Party, if it sustains itself as an intuitionist party, it would actually probably try to move into these venues. I mean, one of the ironies for Trump was that, you know, if Trump wasn't a white nationalist, if he was everything else except a white nationalist, I think he could have made much greater inroads with the African-American and Latino populations, because they also, there's very strong intuitionism within those groups. There's high levels of conspiracy theories. These are marginalized populations. They tend to live with a lot of stress. And a lot of the message that Trump might otherwise be offering would probably be very resonant with them. But, and I think Trump could have done much better, except all the racism that he promulgates. And so, and I think that's a real dilemma for expanding the Republican coalition, because this sort of fervent racist nationalism is a big part of this intuitionist bloc, and it inhibits and it limits what would otherwise be a more expansive kind of populism that they could take advantage of.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And I think we will end here.
And I'm so sorry I can't be there with you. It would be so nice to.
We are sorry as well, but maybe next time. We're looking forward to it, meeting you in the flesh.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.